and welcome to The Popular Show with me, James A. Smith, and my best friend in the world, it's Mr. David Slavic. How you doing, David?
I'm really happy to be here today. I just want you to know that I'm on a secure line using a VPN, two-factor authenticated, protected, and I have my puppy protecting me from Russian hackers.
Nobody is going to get hold of your emails, David, not even our two fantastic guests today. We have with us Tara McCormack, who lectures in international relations at the University of Leicester, and Kit Klarenberg, who is a journalist and contributor to the Grayzone. Now, look, you two are among the most subversive people in the Western Hemisphere. I'm reading in Private Eye this week that the Grayzone, where you publish, Kit, is the leading pro-Kremlin site in the English-speaking world, now that Western governments have closed Putin's RT and Sputnik channels. And I hear from Robert Halfon, MP, Tara, that you are acting as a useful idiot for President Putin's atrocities in the Ukraine, and that the Education Secretary, Nadim Zahawi, has already said that he is on your case. I don't know what you two are smirking about, given that you are personally responsible for the transition to a multipolar world. How's it going? Welcome to The Popular Show. It's great to have you both on. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
It's my pleasure.
I can fit you in between my calls with Putin just for a bit.
Yeah.
I mean, I've got people to poison in about an hour, so let's just hurry through this, shall we?
Well,
they'll die like pigs.
We've got a packed show. We want to say hello to the Sublation Media YouTube audience as ever, as well as the audience on our regular podcast feed. We'd love you to join us at patreon.com/thepopularpod as part of our publishing and podcast community. Later in the show, we're also going to be dropping part of an interview with Robert Freudenthal, who is a psychiatrist in the NHS, who I spoke to earlier this week about working in psychiatry during COVID. It's an amazing discussion, and patrons have already got the whole thing. We're talking about Ukraine and Russia. We're talking about the relationship between new media and the security services, and we're going to be talking about Paul Mason, the sometime Corbynite, and now, thanks to Kit's reporting alongside Max Blumenthal in the Grayzone, we know that Mason has been attempting to collaborate with the security services in order to undermine the left media ecosystem. But first things first, what is going on? I mean, we're hearing a lot about how you two have taken sides with Putin, but that's not what I take from what you've written and what you said. But how do you explain what's going on if this isn't simply a case of an illegitimate state, Russia, invading a legitimate one, Ukraine? What else do we need to know about this situation? Maybe, Tara, you could start us off.
You mean in terms of how we are being, the narratives that we're being presented with at home, or do you mean in terms of the actual conflict?
Well, the way we've put it on this show before now is that it seems that every domestic government in the West has spent the last few months blaming every domestic problem on Russia. Fuel shortages, supply chain problems, inflation, all of this stuff. It's not because of local decision making. It's certainly not because of lockdowns. It's only because of Russia. At the same time, we hear nothing but from the EU, from America, from NATO states, nothing but a discourse of escalation. We need to escalate this war, which is allegedly responsible for all our problems. This seems to me a classic sort of like contradictory borrowed kettle sort of moment where we know that something ideologically interesting is happening. So how do you explain?
What did Johnson do today? You know, he was meant to be going to Doncaster to meet a bunch of really angry Tory MPs, and he changed I don't even know en route, but he cancelled the meeting and dashed off to Kiev because he was jealous, of course, of the scenes of Zelensky and Macron, in a close brotherly embrace, and obviously, oh my gosh, it's far easier, and this has been a classic thing when it comes to foreign policy, it's far easier, of course, to grandstand abroad than to govern at home, and that's something that you see with many, many Western states. I mean, there is an extreme incapacity there. Many Western states are no longer functioning very well, and kind of find it far easier to have some kind of a ZAP governing using emergency, whether that's COVID, now sort of sliding very nicely into the Ukraine war. It's far easier, I think, for example, our government to do that than to attempt to grapple with, the serious problems that we have at home, which I would argue are mostly to do with the responses to COVID in terms of lockdowns. But globally, of course, China's continuous lockdowns are obviously crushing the global supply chain, etc. So I think there's very much a form, sort of, I guess as the kids say, oh look, squirrel, to kind of take attention away from what's going on. We see this repeatedly with Johnson sort of jetting off to Kiev and grandstanding about British support, which, by the way, and this is my pet hobby horse, has been done extremely anti-democratically. No one has asked us if we agree with that. No one has asked us, the voters, if we agree with, for example, signing up to security guarantees with Sweden or Finland. So much for Boris, the great Brexiteer, bringing sovereignty back to the country, but we see that in foreign policy, completely the opposite. So that's my sort of particular hobby horse about.
Yeah, it really seems like both Britain and America, both Joe Biden and Boris Johnson, ostensibly leaders of left and right, respectively. Nonetheless, they're united in actually putting aside their own domestic priorities. Boris Johnson abandoning the Red Wall kind of talks that he was supposed to be in over the weekend, where he's supposed to be shoring up his support at a moment of crisis. Joe Biden just shamelessly hemorrhaging money to Ukraine while he's guaranteed to have an utter humiliation at the midterms later this year. Kit, what is your interpretation of why this war has been so heavily mediatized? I gather that the media coverage in the immediate weeks of the war was proportionately far bigger than coverage of the Iraq war in the early 2000s. Why has so much attention, both media and in terms of governance, been directed to this conflict of all conflicts?
I mean, I think it's interesting to make a comparison with the Iraq War, because I think that in the intervening period, you have seen like the rise of think tanks, like within the media sphere, an endless, procession of talking heads, and also, yes, the rise of social media. And it's like, that we've seen on a pretty much, I mean, can you imagine how tedious World War II must have been, like, if Twitter was around, where it's like, oh, the Nazis are winning, oh, they're not, just going on and on and on, just forever, for like 6 years. And I think that, so essentially, I really noticed it, but I think it'd been going on for a few weeks, and there was someone a friend of mine said that they couldn't make head nor tail of what was happening. And I said, well, just ignore it, because no one knows what's happening. We have no idea, because we're getting minute by minute updates, and which are heavily, because of the ban on RT and other forms of Russian funded media. And yes, because of the rise of defense funded think tank, we're getting one very specific picture of the war, and it's not helpful. Like, it took the Americans, and the British, the best part of a month to reach Baghdad when they invaded Iraq in 2003, with assisted by a saturation bombing campaign. And even then, there were like predictions that the invasion of Baghdad would be another Stalingrad, and that like the Americans had bitten off more than that they could chew, and there's going to be this kind of shock, upset David and Goliath victory by the Iraqis, which was obviously nonsense, and so I think that also we have seen this policy was inaugurated before the war even started, but Britain and America have been intelligence services in Britain and America have taken a kind of unprecedented role in issuing quote unquote intelligence, like information, which is then recycled in the media. In Britain, the numerous kind of official British government Twitter accounts have been posting infographics based on this intelligence, and yes, they invariably point to Russian embarrassment and failure, and Ukrainian success and heroism. And this narrative has been absolutely fundamental to ensuring the endless, unaccountable flow of weapons to Ukraine. It has helped serve as a disincentive for Zelensky to enter peace talks, and it's also helped to really sell the idea of conflict to the public. And the reality is that this is horrible for everyone involved in it. Dragging it on is just going to result in more destruction, more misery, more trauma. But the average person in Britain or America doesn't want that. So therefore, it is necessary to focus on this kind of bogus narrative of success. And now we have the rise of intelligence releases, think tanks, and the full blown censorship of the internet and independent media, which has been a goal and objective of Western power for a very long time. It's a very furtive environment for total informational warfare assault.
This doesn't even factor in, and I think you're being actually quite charitable, because your description doesn't even factor in a lot of the mythology that is being created. We had the who is the Red Baron of the Ukrainian Army Air Force that they talked about, the Ghost of Kiev.
The Ghost of Kiev.
The Ghost of Kiev. We had the Snake Island story.
Snake Island.
We had the woman who threw pickles and down the drones. And I have to say that in an era where everything is checkable in a way and being distributed by people who view themselves as fact checkers, we're seeing a mythology that only Paul Bunyan would be jealous of.
I know.
Sorry. Go ahead, Tara.
One of the things that I think I'm sure I may have mentioned this before at some point, but to me, one of the really interesting things about this sort of first post-COVID war is that we very much see the kind of COVID, I think COVID in the way that it was covered by the media, and the media literally just channeling, government propaganda, government narratives. I think COVID kind of picked up from a foreign policy model. And a lot of things were kind of consolidated around COVID, but in terms of kind of nudge, all the stuff we know about scaring people, getting people, creating, the boundaries of the kind of acceptable debate, and pretty kind of ferocious policing of that. And of course, so that has always been something that's gone on when it comes to foreign policy. But I think even like 20 years ago, you had more space in the media for critical accounts. You had people like John Pilger writing for The Mirror. You don't have any of that anymore. So what we have are kind of a meeting of lots of malign trends in a way. I think government has really kind of worked around COVID in terms of channeling the narrative. The media have basically done nothing but, repeat that narrative. Of course, 2 years on, lots of people are piping up saying, hey, well, maybe lockdown wasn't that good. So, yeah, well, you could have talked about that 2 years ago. But anyway, so we've had that. And I think in a way, now we're seeing that happening with Ukraine, in that absolutely ferocious kind of policing of the parameters of acceptable debate. And David, as you're saying, these kind of quite ridiculous things which are obviously kind of propaganda, in a really classic sense, presenting these kind of, ludicrous stories that any journalist could probably find out the truth of it. But the thing is that the journalists don't want to.
Yeah, I think that thinking of this as the first post-COVID conflict is a very, very useful framing, because what do we see that's novel about this? The kind of comfort about just cutting off whole sectors or sections or regions. I mean, it's remarkable to see corporations withdrawing from Russia, when in the last 40 years the whole idea has been it's a mark of American success if a country has a McDonald's in it. Now that's been dropped, and we're happy to just totally seal off Russia as its own kind of reality.
And sports, everything. You didn't have that at the height of the Cold War.
Yeah.
It's phenomenal. Yeah. It's phenomenal.
Refusing Russian applicants to universities. This like state of this super state of emergency, where any kind of idea of due process or individual kind of liberal rights or whatever, not even that has lip service paid to it. Yeah. Why? Maybe Kit, you could take us a little bit into the kind of significance of Ukraine specifically, because dissident commentators such as yourselves have been saying continually through this conflict that really we've got to go back at least to 2014 to understand it. This wasn't just a kind of spontaneous invasion where overnight Putin's just suddenly kind of done this. This is a very kind of complex situation. We talked about it with Michael Tracy on earlier episodes. But what's your, without necessarily telling the whole kind of backstory, what for you is significant about Ukraine in particular? Why does the West care about that in a way that it doesn't necessarily care about Yemen, Somalia, other kind of conflict zones that are alive at the moment?
Well, I mean, yes. I mean, like, number one, I think it helps that Ukrainians have white skin, and yes, we've seen an enormous amount of dog whistle racism in the media coverage of this, where people are they're talking about thermobaric weapons, and I think it was. Christ, what's his name? Some awful BBC presenter. Anyway, he said, Jeremy Vine, I think, he said, like, oh, well, the US used this in Afghanistan, but, this is Europe and it's a bit different. So there's that aspect to it. But also as well, I think that, we have had, Chris Hedges wrote very effectively at the start of this war that effectively, NATO, in lieu of Russia being a, aggressive hostile enemy, it was necessary to create an aggressive and hostile enemy. And so we have had longer than that, 3 decades, but in particular the last 8 years, when after the Maidan coup, which was entirely Western orchestrated and managed, US led, that in the intervening 8 years, you had an aggressive shift towards the West, which was actually not popular with pretty much half, if not a majority, of the Ukrainian population. Like, if you cut back to 2014, there was some very, very good work, which was entirely ignored by academics with an interest and a specialism in Eastern Europe, who were saying that, look, hey, half of the, about 50 to 60% of the Ukrainian population, identify as, kind of Russian or, kind of Russian sympathetic. Like, a significant portion of the population speaks Russian as their first, if not only, language. And so, there was within the protest movement, there was this very strong nationalist element, which was heavily overrepresented versus their representation in parliament, say. And so, we've had 8 years of, a proxy war in the East, which, actually, Russian involvement in it and the scale of Russian involvement in it has been grossly exaggerated, distorted. The residents of Donbass and Luhansk have lived under, almost daily shelling. According to UN figures for, I think it was 2018 to 2022, that the 80% of the casualties were on the kind of quote unquote rebel side. Like Azov Battalion and other kind of far right groups serving as like private security forces, just going around cities harassing people. And so that narrative that this has come out of nowhere and is completely unprovoked. I've heard a lot of people say it, and it's just again, it's a triumph of propaganda that and we hear about the prowess and the ingenuity of Russian propaganda. I mean, none of the stuff that was actually happening in the Donbass ever leaked out into the mainstream media ever. Like, to the extent that there was acknowledgement that the Azov were a brutal fascist fraternity. This was always couched in terms of, oh well, but ultimately they're fighting a Russian invasion of their country, which didn't happen. Like it just, it didn't. Even then, the Guardian published. I think it was in 2015. They published actually a fairly illuminating article on the Nazi sympathies of people involved in Azov and their kind of plans for it to create a kind of all-white Europe via a revolution based on ISIS principles. And even then, they were the line was, well, they ultimately remain very good at fighting Russians, and they're a very effective fighting force. Therefore, they are effectively an asset to the Ukrainian state, and they should be left alone, and that sort of thing. I mean, yeah, I think that fundamentally what the war in Ukraine has done has sped up a lot of kind of slow burn pre-existing plans for isolating Russia totally from the Western kind of political and financial order. It has sped up plans for crackdowns and internal dissent at home. And yeah, I mean, and I think that in some ways, power has gotten what it wanted. But that's the thing about war is that often there are that effectively the way that we've been looking at the global economy is completely skewed. And so, we heard many courses of how Russia was effectively an oil rig with an economy the size of Italy's or Spain. Actually, based on the kind of wider deleterious impact of the sanctions on Russia that have had on the world. There are some estimates that Russia accounts for about 20% of the world's GDP. They're a lot more significant and richer than was hoped and thought. And I mean, again, that in itself is a testament to the growth and the success of think tanks who pump out all of this nonsense in service of their corporate state and quasi-state paymasters to demonize Russia. Can
I just wanted to add on the history, if I may jump in there, Kit, before we move on from the history. Just one thing as well. When Zelensky was elected, part of his mandate was actually to make peace in Donbass.
Yes.
And as I think again, as the UN has said, something like since 2014, 14,000 people killed in Donbass. So that was part of his mandate, actually, to make peace, actually, to kind of implement the Minsk agreements, which, of course, again, no one really talks about, apart, of course, from people like Peter Hitchens and us. But what happened? The ultra-nationalists said, do it and we'll kill you. So Zelensky actually had a mandate to resolve in a peaceful way Donbass. But he wasn't allowed because the internal political forces wouldn't permit it. So that's another issue that's going on. To what extent, anyway? Obviously, we know that Boris Johnson has gone to Kiev and said to Zelensky, even if you want to negotiate, we don't want to negotiate. This was like a month ago or something. But it's also very difficult to know, and I certainly don't know actually what's going on in terms of the government internally in Ukraine. Yeah,
where the actual agency behind all this is. Yeah,
exactly. What policies are allowed? I don't know enough about Ukraine internal politics to.
One thing that you can say is that and this is a very American example, but the power of the government comes from the purse, and who is the purse right now? It's the United States, it's the UK, it's the EU, it's NATO. And if spending power is the number one power of government, and as it is in many places, then you have to say, well, I think we do know who's in charge. And if you look at the meeting with Boris Johnson, and you look at those types of things, and you look how these long-term deals. I just heard an interview today about the $40 billion that went to Ukraine recently. Most of that money won't come for the next 10 years. So what that's setting up is not just a war here, it's setting up a client state for 10 years. So I think that in the long run, the levers of power, I think, are pretty predetermined.
Yeah. And also, just to dive in, I mean, we know as well that from 2014, Ukraine Ukrainian army was, I don't know the technical, where it was sort of set up to be interoperable with NATO, so there was a huge amount of money going in as well, post-Crimea training, etc. So this is a sort of longer term shift.
So just as lockdown was a policy pursued with a huge amounts of compulsory moral blackmail, and you were morally evil if you departed from it. And what's it left us with? A neoliberal hellscape where the poor are poorer, the rich are richer. What this latest compulsory moral crusade, on which no dissent can be tolerated, is going to leave us with is a sealed off Russia and a neoliberal debtor client state on its border that is owing everything to the West for the foreseeable future.
I mean, I think it'll be interesting, if you don't mind me just diving in, because one of the really interesting things that's occasionally mentioned, very disapprovingly, but not really that much, is how little the rest of the world are interested in this conflict. For most of the developing world, this is seen as a regional Western spat. And, whether we like it or not, and, people don't want to talk about it. And if you say it, people say, oh, it's so anti-Western, whether we like it or not. For many countries in the world, the biggest security threat is understood to be America, and probably the UK and France, depending on where you're sitting as well. And that's just a fact. No one wants to talk about it. So actually, for most of the world, but that also includes, as we know, American client states like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Israel. They're even Israel, with all the massive amounts of money, and Saudi, they're not really interested. I mean, Saudi and UAE clearly not in any way interested, do not want to get into a conflict, are not interested in weaponizing oil, anything. But even Israel has been pretty much, I did have to chuckle when Zelensky went to the Knesset and urged the Israeli MPs to treat Ukraine as Ukraine had treated the Jews, or something really weird.
That's a good thought.
Come on,
I think that some of our relatives in Lviv from 60, 70 years ago would not agree with that, And I see here in Canada where we're essentially a Ukrainian client state right now. Krista Freeland is a Ukrainian nationalist. Her father was a Banderite. Her grandfather was a Banderite, and he ran a Nazi newspaper in Germany. The disconnect between the population here, like your everyday population, who's very sort of progressively liberal in a vague sense, and the sort of military establishment here is really there's a huge disconnect. But people here know the difference between the types of Ukrainians, because we have 40 different Nazi memorials sitting in Canada based upon some of these ultra nationalists. So people are keen to this here, and you're really seeing some of that public support fall apart.
Yeah, I mean, just again, like one of the interesting things I think compared to COVID is you have this absolutely ferocious narrative management, to put it politely. But when talking to normal people, of course, you kind of pass by, houses with the odd house with the Ukrainian flags and so on. But I don't get the sense, just walking around, that most people are really invested in this conflict in Britain. I think if you talk to people, oh yes, isn't Putin terrible? And then move on. Oh, and did you see, X, Y, and Z? I don't know, and I don't mean that in a flippant way, but I think for most people on the ground, they are looking at Ukraine in the way that we look at Yemen, or you know what I mean. It's a conflict that's happening, and that's a kind of interesting. So that'll be interesting on domestically how that will ultimately play out. I don't know.
Yeah, you're watching The Popular Show.
Also, I want to ask you too, because sorry.
I was just speaking to the YouTube audience, David, but yeah, by all means, but ask a last question for the segment, please.
So I wanted to just ask quickly, is that, from the outside, looking into the UK, I have to ask, given, sort of the immigration status of Ukrainians and Poles and Eastern Europeans and how they've been treated in the last 5 to 10 years, it's really funny to see them being reintegrated as Westerners in the narrative. And I don't think people are buying it, because they've, propagandized against these people domestically for so long. I don't see how you can make them as sympathetic as they'd like.
Yeah, I haven't really, I mean, again, I think, I don't know what Kid thinks, but I mean, again, certainly I think, or James, I mean, I haven't particularly encountered a huge amount of hostility to immigrants again in my daily life, but then it is true I live in central London and in a kind of particular milieu. I'm not talking about academic milieu, obviously that's a different thing, but kind of not in my day-to-day life. So I think that was probably slightly overdone in terms of the way it was reported. It didn't really reflect, I think, just normal life. But certainly you had this huge outpouring of sympathy for Ukrainian refugees and a homes for Ukrainian refugees kind of schema set up whereby, people could share their homes. Now, unfortunately, that's all collapsed.
Yeah. I think that the Eastern European was one of the imagination as opposed to one of reality, and has quite easily been substituted for the good Ukrainian for most people's purposes.
Well, I mean, the thing is that you say that like it has been reported that there have been numerous Ukrainians who were taken in by families in Britain who've been effectively asked to leave. Which is pretty tragic, and I think that a lot of people who were swept up by this this kind of pro-Ukrainian war propaganda thought that they would be they didn't really think about what this would actually entail, and it's a dog is not for life. Sorry, a dog is for life, not just for Christmas, right? Like they didn't really kind of calculate. Well, you're taking in a human being who is traumatized fleeing a war zone, who has a completely different language and culture to me. That might actually be quite problematic. And there was an article in The Guardian which was mentioning how a Ukrainian family had moved into the home of a vegetarian, and obviously because people in Eastern Europe eat a lot of meat, this created significant problems between the host and her guests, and so they were asked to leave. And you just think that this is just some Guardian reading idiot who didn't do any due diligence into the implications of taking in a Ukrainian to their home, and then when it wasn't all sunshine and roses, and possibly when he didn't sleep with them, and it's a bit like, oh, could you leave now? Because actually this is quite difficult. It's just it's crazy to me. And the UN has also issued a statement early on saying that they were concerned with what was they were concerned about the potential of Ukrainian women arriving in the UK being kind of sexually exploited and by their hosts and all this stuff. And so in Prague, there are now signs outside various shops saying, "Please don't come in if you're Ukrainian," because they've had theft and stuff. And this is what happens when people fleeing war zones often are prohibited from working, and they have to eat somehow. I think that there's, by getting wrapped up in all of this, I'm doing my bit for humanity by, my country's doing its bit for humanity by taking in, vast, almost unaccountable numbers of refugees. No one was actually thinking that, hey, this might actually, have some consequences that I don't like, don't make me feel good about myself.
You're watching The Popular Show. We want you to like and subscribe Sublation Media YouTube channel, and we want you to follow us and ideally subscribe to us at patreon.com/ThePopularPod. We're going to carry on talking to Kit Klarenberg and Tara McCormack. But before that, we're going to drop in a segment now. The lockdowns in Britain were consistently represented as measures to protect the NHS. However, working in mental health services during lockdown painted a very different picture. I spoke to Robert Freudenthal, who's a psychiatrist in the NHS, about the experience, and here's a bit of that interview now.
that I have been quite open about my views really from quite early on, and they did not seem to me to be particularly controversial when talking about with colleagues. So on the front line, many people sort of seem to me to agree about the flaws, if maybe not having quite as seeing the critique in the whole, if you like, but could kind of reflect on the various flaws and challenges with the response that we did. And I think that's what you would expect, because so many of the policies just did not make sense in the lives of the people we're working with. So I would wonder how you could full-heartedly support the lockdown approach and really think that is the only course of action, the right course of action, when we were seeing how it just did not work in the lives of people we were seeing. And that comes down to also things like masking. If you're working on a older adult mental health ward, the idea that you wear masks when you're talking with patients who have cognitive and sensory difficulties is absurd. You're constantly having to take your mask off, of course. So these critiques were fairly common. And then I think what helped with terms of actual organising, sort of on the ground organising, and people maybe being a bit more vocal about their views, was when the sort of NHS vaccine mandates came in, and then there was more organisation from those staff members that were not vaccinated, and then from staff members that were vaccinated and wanted to support them. And it became quite easy for those groups to organise, at least in the areas where I work, because the trust was organising sort of teams meetings to discuss it. And so you would be able to identify who the other people were, or who either were unvaccinated or had concerns about the mandate. And then there was quite a bit of organisation and more sort of groups forming where people could talk a bit more openly about some of these issues. But I have to say, from my perspective, and something I really do actually value, is that at least in mental health services, and the experience might be different in other NHS sectors, but at least in mental health services or mental health services in the areas where I work, I do think there is actually a very good culture of free speech. And I've never felt personally that I would be sort of faltered or would suffer in any way from speaking openly about these things, and have done and will continue to organise educational sessions where we discuss some of these ideas as well. So there is a good culture around that, I think. However, whether that actually translates into sort of policy on the ground is obviously another issue.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's not, one's expectations are lowered. It's not like you are demanding of your colleagues being sort of paid up anti-lockdown, anti-mandate organisers. Just the fact that there is some kind of acceptance that, as on everything, a diversity of views is possible. I think that that's very culturally interesting, actually, that the people who were in full lockdown and were only getting this, I mean, Britain led the way in the propaganda, the use of organised fear as a form of control during COVID. So basically, you had people at home who only had this kind of most exaggerated picture of how bad it was out there and the scale of the danger out there, and who only had this kind of perverted form of communication of social media to have any kind of contact with other people. Where if you tweeted in the midst of the first or the 2021 lockdown, I miss the pub, lol, you would immediately be accused of wanting disabled people to die. In that kind of circumstance, it's not surprising that people at least publicly took the uniform views that they did. Whereas if you're having to go into work as normal, if you're seeing that masks are not practical in all circumstances, if you're seeing what the nature of the risk actually is. I mean, I started commuting in September, returned to commuting in September 2020, and like at first I was very tentative, and then realized I'm not getting it. It's just I've not been struck down instantaneously as I'd been kind of warned that I would be. You kind of you have a more realistic kind of idea of the scale of the risk to somebody of your age and your level of health. So yeah, inevitably a more kind of like heterodox group of views becomes possible, and yeah, a more kind of intuitive sense of the actual scale of what the risk was for most people becomes possible. So yeah, I mean, as time goes on, it would be really interesting to hear more experiential accounts from health workers. So far, those have been sort of cherry picked for, maximum horror porn. Really, it's what's good about what you're describing is this kind of much more banal experience of it, where where different risks were interlocking with each other, and COVID was one of those things. Something that I was thinking when you were talking was like with churches closed, with day centres closed, these other kinds of pastoral care that exist in the community, such as it is under normal circumstances. Did you find there was a kind of like creep in terms of your responsibilities or the role you ended up taking in these patients' lives, because you were presumably one of a very small number of people that they were actually seeing on a regular basis?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, a couple of things to that. I mean, one is, I would argue that you can't be, if the purpose of psychiatry, which I think it is to help people to feel more connected with themselves and the world around them as a response to mental illness, I don't think you can actually be a psychiatrist in a lockdown society, because how can you help people feel more connected with the world around them when they're not legally allowed to do that? So that's one thing. But the other thing is actually that, and something which I really benefited from, was working in North London mental health services across groups from the whole sort of economic social class spectrum. It became fairly obvious fairly early on that those that the lockdowns did not make sense in the lives of many people, but particularly also of working class communities who were often still continuing to work in person, or maybe we live in multi-generational households where we have extended family networks which they would continue to maintain. And so actually lots of people weren't following the lockdown rules, and that was quite helpful to see. Was that actually, that gave me some real positivities. That actually we're not all subsumed to this kind of authoritarian, centralized power bureaucracy, that lots of people just remove themselves from that relationship and don't follow the rules, or weren't even aware of what some of the rules were. And that gave me huge sort of strength and positivity. And I really do feel, from a sort of class perspective, that the sort of lockdown, follow the rules mentality was a bit of a sort of middle class preoccupation. We know that the ruling classes just, particularly Johnson's colleagues and himself, didn't really follow the rules. For working class people, I don't think the rules would have made much sense. So broke as many rules as they could, or just didn't see the need to follow them in that way. So that gave me some positivity as well, sort of seeing people and realize that, well, actually, I'm just one person that they're seeing. They're still maintaining, lots of different relationships. And I could give you some examples. One sort of comic example was somebody in one of the lockdowns, who I saw in an emergency situation, and they were working they'd been in a party, got drunk, had all these mental health sort of crisis, and they worked in a COVID testing center. So even people working within the COVID bureaucracy were not, did not all subsume themselves to the sort of lockdown rules. So, and that's something which which I'm sort of interested in, is what is it about a group or a sector of society that made them vulnerable to this, to entering into this authoritarian relationship. Obviously, some people were forced into that. If you lived if you're in a prison or in a mental health unit, or in a care home, you had no choice, you had no agency, it was just forced on you. But lots of people who live independently were able to just sidestep the issue.
Yeah. I think that's really important because as you know, the critique of lockdowns builds, and no doubt it will be the common sense sooner or later. You can already see that actually the interpretation, and I've been guilty of this myself, is often kind of top down. Like what did elites force people to do? But there's another way of seeing this, as you described, which is, well, you could almost say that the more commodified your relations already were, the more structured by work and digital platforms your life already was, the more likely you were to be in a situation where you couldn't have any kind of standpoint of critique of what you were being told to do, and the more likely you were to go along with it. So yeah, okay, there were, as the common critique goes, there was an element of self-interest for those who had somewhere nice to live, and for whom working from home wasn't so much more alienating from in comparison to what it was they were already doing. But as you described, if you were somebody, if you were outside that kind of professional class milieu, it was more likely that you did still live near family, you did still have these kind of networks outside, like your immediate kind of housemates or family or nuclear family, and more likely to have some sort of space of resistance or space for kind of seeing it differently, and the propaganda wouldn't quite work in the same way.
Yeah. And I suppose for me as well, something which I drew a lot of hope from and continue to do so was that in my view, sort of totalitarian lockdown or other expressions of totalitarianism societies are, they're fundamentally very weak, because it means that your primary relationship is just between you and the government or the system of power or authority, and you don't have those relationships with your peers and with other members of the community. And that's a weak sort of relational basis on which society to be structured. Whereas if you have sort of complex relationships with other people in your community and extended family networks or other networks, then that's always going to be more powerful and more meaningful to you than that one relationship with the government or the position of authority. And I suppose we could talk a lot more about this, or think much more about this, but I wonder about where capital fits in with this, and where if you're living in a sort of bourgeois type life where you've sort of accumulated a bit of capital, which then leads to more isolated existence, where those community relationships are disrupted or no longer exist, then but then you would be much more vulnerable to this sort of type of totalitarianism. And I think we've seen that through history, where we know that academic being an academic, intellectual education and so on, or being a professional, none of those things are particularly protective against authoritarianism. I don't think that they ever have been. And the other thing I sort of think about is, as much as we talk and rightly talk about the sort of destruction of community structures, of unions, stable workplaces, even pubs, etc., political parties, and so on, there are still lots of people that do live in really wonderful, supportive communities, and I see that all the time. I've seen for example, recently I saw somebody who's lives in a residential estate and is completely, is disabled, wheelchair bound, lives alone, but their neighbours on either side look out for them multiple times a day, check in on them, despite not even speaking the same language. And those sorts of community relationships are still there. And the idea that people who maintain those community relationships will suddenly just stop them and abandon the people that they care about is that wouldn't happen. And so I do wonder whether the people that did follow the lockdown rules to the T, I wonder that must have some fairly weak community relationships to begin with, to be willing to withdraw.
Robert Robert Freudenthal there. And if you want to hear the full interview, you just need to get over to patreon.com/popularpod to get the full hour with Robert. We're back with Kit and with Tara, and we're talking about the mediatization of the Russia-Ukraine war in the West and the involvement of the security services in new media, the media in general, and the reporting of it. And now we've got to get to the real juicy stuff, this amazing story that Kit, along with the editor of the Grayzone, Max Blumenthal, broke a couple of weeks ago, concerning Paul Mason. Now, for viewers and listeners outside the UK who maybe don't know who Paul Mason is, maybe I can hand over to Kit and Tara to get your sort of introductory picture.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that, I think that, yes, I mean, the viewers who are unfamiliar with Paul Mason are really rather fortunate. But he's he's this ostensibly left-wing journalist. He's been quite prominent in the media for some time. He worked at the BBC for many years. Then he was at Channel 4. He was a regular contributor to the New Statesman. And he has, been quite closely aligned with various, seemingly radical causes. He was a major advocate of Syriza in Greece, and wrote, in the wake of the financial crisis, was, presenting, fairly subversive perspectives, in the mainstream media on capitalism and socialism, and this is always. And he was a big, at least publicly, supporter of Corbyn, although it seems he was rather undermining him behind the scenes. But I think that this has always been rather bizarrely combined with a very, very hawkish kind of interventionist perspective in foreign policy. He has seriously argued on several occasions that people working in people working in a kind of BAE Systems, which is a major British defence contractor, people working in those factories, they're part of this kind of working class solidarity movement because they are helping spread kind of freedom and oppose tyranny overseas, and very, very strange stuff. And in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, this seems to have become completely turbocharged, and he's led many very, very made very aggressive statements condemning people on the left, particularly the anti-war left, who do not support arming Ukraine, who have suggested that, actually NATO and indeed Western countries have played a significant role in provoking this conflict, which is, a fairly uncontroversial view, which has been held by people not typically known for their anti-establishment views, like Henry Kissinger, for instance. And so he's also done stuff like call for a state censorship mechanism to protect the left from dangerous viewpoints which might mislead them and play into the hands of Putin. And so we were shocked but not somehow surprised when at Grayzone we received anonymously a large number of emails between Mason and this individual called Anil Khan, who is a long-time British government PSYOPs warrior. He was heavily involved as a contractor in the Syrian crisis, providing media support to armed groups, training citizen journalists and opposition activists to better communicate with the Western media in service of regime change. And also Mason has been emailing this academic called Emma Bryant, who's a kind of fairly prominent anti-disinfo researcher, but also most kind of disturbingly, this individual called Andy Price, who is a kind of long time and he's described as a kind of career diplomat. But really, he cropped up on my radar about 3.5 years ago, when a large number of files related to the Integrity Initiative, which was a secret Foreign Office information warfare operation that effectively it was staffed by military and intelligence veterans, and it maintained what they called clusters, which were these secret networks in Western countries of journalists and academics and pundits, think tank representatives, military officials, who could be used to disseminate and perpetuate ceaseless black propaganda about enemy states like China and Russia, particularly the latter, and also kind of traduce domestic and foreign opponents, on an individual level, like Julian Assange and now former Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn, which was against charity rules. We got in a lot of trouble for doing that when it was exposed by leaks. So that was run by what was called the Counter Disinformation and Media Development Unit of the Foreign Office, which is run by spies. Is very much part of the intelligence apparatus. And Price was seemingly the kind of godfather of this operation. He was the head of CDMD. And so it very much appears that Mason has been coordinating, if not being handled and directed, in his kind of left-busting, anti-war busting activities by this very shadowy individual. There's virtually no information about him online. And on the one hand, it's a kind of callback to the Cold War, Operation Mockingbird, numerous kind of British journalists who were effectively agents of the state, who were, past intelligence and black and grey propaganda, in secret. But this very much again, it's that kind of 2.0. It's that on steroids. And Mason was in direct kind of discussions with Price about creating what he called an international information brigade, which would have been like Integrity Initiative, i.e., an effective secret. Intelligence operation targeting the anti-war left that was posing as a kind of civil society anti-disinfo initiative. Mason's imagination ran wild, and he was imagining having this website where they would publish videos and pictures of Russian prisoners of war, because the media isn't allowed to do that, and also have a kind of regular fixture called Putin Proxy Watch, where they would kind of name and shame people who were serving as Kremlin assets by challenging the established narrative on events, particularly related to the war in Ukraine. And so, again, when we started reporting on this, it generated an enormous amount of interest on the left, particularly the kind of Corbynite left, who've been rather ignored since the election of Starmer, if not outright silenced and ostracized. And again, people were shocked, but they weren't surprised. He's been going after these people, these same elements, very aggressive publicly. And therefore, it seems quite logical that he's being, assisted in this by this deep state actor.
I think that for maybe younger people or people who have started to pay attention to these kind of politics or to Paul Mason in particular, just in the last couple of years, they would have seen him a big advocate of Keir Starmer and often slightly abasing himself actually as being the sort of tame Corbynista who's willing to speak up for Starmer in the media, apparently with very little reward. It's actually been quite an embarrassing couple of years as far as Starmer's, Mason's relationship to the Labour Party is concerned. And then they will have heard him at the start of the invasion in February. They will have heard him adding his voice to those both in the States and in Britain and Europe of nominally left figures who have leapt on this as an opportunity to ostracize and delegitimize anti-imperialist voices on the left and on the right. So I think for people who have only seen him doing that and then about the revelations in your work, they'll be a little bit confused about why he ever had any standing in the Corbyn project and on the left at all. But I want to drop this clip, which kind of explains it. It's kind of interesting to revisit now. This was shortly after Corbyn's surprise, reversal of Labour's downward fortunes in 2017, where Mason is a guest at the Progress group, which was the kind of Tony Blair group that then became a very bitter right-wing outfit during the Corbyn years.
The question was that tweet and others contributed to a feeling that there are people who are not welcome in the Labour Party.
You are all welcome.
But only if we do exactly as you say. Only if we do exactly as you say. And
you are all welcome in Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party.
But in one in which you're not allowed to speak your mind, or you must be bullied.
You're speaking it now. You're speaking your mind now. We're hearing it.
But you want us out if we do. You want us out if we do.
No.
What's your saying otherwise?
What do you mean?
We have a choice. Be in and be silent.
No, I just said. I'm sure. In case you're misunderstanding me, just listen. If you want a centrist party, this is not going to be it for the next 10 years. if it's really important to you to have a pro-Remain party that is in favour of illegal war, in favour of privatisation, form your own party and get on with it.
So I think that accounts for why the Corbynistas embraced Mason. One, he already had a reputation, a Channel 4 newscaster, and he wasn't formally of the left particularly, although he had that earlier Trotsky phase that everyone in the British media had that. So it was like he kind of proved our point because, reality had become, capitalism had gone in a certain way where actually the left solution was the right ones, and here's a guy with establishment standing that proves it. Number one. Number two, he's got that gruff, no nonsense, masculine, regional accent thing, which kind of contrasted with the sort of lily-livered southern daintiness of much of the English left, and he was willing to sort of he was willing to be quite aggressive to our enemies, which was something that not a lot of people were actually that comfortable with. The sad irony there is he's saying if you want a pro-Remain party that's in favour of illegal war, get out of Corbyn's Labour Party. The tragedy there is he would become one of the voices that committed Corbynism to the Remain would drift, which ruined us in 2019. And now he's apparently in favour of illegal war, in that he believes that any criticism of NATO is totally illegitimate. Never mind Iraq, never mind Libya, never mind Syria, etc. So, there's a way in which you can sort of see why people thought he was valuable, but there's also already the kind of makings of where it's going to go wrong subsequently, I think.
I think it's different. I mean, I've seen some people suggest that, when he was in his kind of seeming radical phase, that this was all a front. I mean, he does seem rather kind of passionate, and I mean, maybe he's just gotten very, very, very good training in how to appear convincing from his deep state handlers. But I mean, I do think that it's a recurrent story on the left, where particularly former Trotskyists, it seems. Christopher Hitchens is the most obvious example of someone who just kind of went off the deep end from being, aggressively anti-war to aggressively pro-war, and smearing, anti-war figures as cowards and apologists for fascism and that sort of thing. And then it seems to rather give that up when the war went terribly, and it kind of affected his bank account potentially. But I don't know. I suspect there's almost a kind of God that failed effect here. At work here, whereby it was very de rigueur, particularly post 2017, even amongst kind of the intelligentsia, middle classes, to be or at least pretend to be really radical. In the wake of, the Guardian overnight are having produced and smeared Corbyn for 2 years by that point, suddenly was publishing op-eds about that were effectively calling for an anarchist revolution and the overturning of the financial system and all of these all these kind of radical propositions. And then things kind of at the start of 2018, if kind of mid 2018, started to go awry, and then that's when you have the kind of the rise of second vote movements, and kind of the EU becomes whether Britain is leaving, not on what terms, kind of becomes the dominant narrative. And that in itself was pushed by intelligence actors. I have an article coming on this whereby there was a political party in Britain that was calling for, the first source to call for a second referendum. This is a very obscure political party called Renew, that was an MI6 officer and a NATO propagandist, and they got an enormous amount of press coverage and seemed to lay the foundations for the creation of the Change UK or whatever they were called. But I would like to think that he was to a degree sincere, and then I don't know if it's his old age or just maybe he that kind of bandwagon of Corbynism was just it's just kind of withered and died. That now he's hopping on, another opportunity to be, a prominent public figure and, speak with a lot of self-righteous, incendiary rhetoric, which is great for social media, smearing people as teasers in the vein of Neville Chamberlain for suggesting that actually maybe it's not the best idea to, just keep endlessly arming Ukraine, particularly when there is this significant kind of far right element within their military. I don't know. What's your thoughts, Tara?
Before we turn to Tara, I'm going to break in because we've got to say goodbye to the YouTube audience. We're going to carry on talking. There's so much more to ask. We're going to talk for a little bit more if Kit and Tara will allow it. But you're going to have to jump over to the podcast feed over at patreon.com/thepopularpod for the rest of the conversation. We hope we'll see you there. If not, tune into The Popular Show on Sublation Media YouTube next week.